All right, finally got the time to do this. This is something we did on stream the other day. This is our Stream Raiders tier list for units. Now, before we jump into any of this, I want to go ahead and say this is an overall look at all of the units in Stream Raiders. This isn't something where it's very specific for, say, PvP or, for dungeons or just strictly PvE. This is something that is an overall look at the unit and how useful it is as a unit. There's going to be differing opinions depending on the size of the captain, how big of a captain you are, how, say if you're hooks and you have access to a bunch of artilleries, obviously artillery becomes more prevalent at that point. But this is just something that I'm going to go over all of the units just to kind of get a feel on which units really are the strongest in Stream Raiders. All right, so starting out, we're actually going to start out with the broken or the S tier units. And this is something that can be debated over and over. And a lot of people will say certain units are broken. Say if you're a smaller captain and one buster gets placed in PvP and it can ruin everything and kill a bunch of units, and you can say that it's super overpowered. Same thing with a blue buster. There's just a bunch of different views on different units and everything. But personally, I feel the most absolute strongest unit in the entire game is the Monk. The Monk is probably the most broken unit. It is the most useful unit. It heals. It's basically the better melee. It's the best melee in the game. It has two very good specs. It has Grand and it has Mighty. Mighty makes it where it tears through tanks more. Grand makes it where it heals in a wider range. So there becomes pseudo healers, and at level 30 that becomes really, really strong. Outside of that, monks, you get to be able to place them because they're a rare unit, so you can place them decently often, especially if you have dupes. It really kind of works out overall. There's nothing that is kind of game breaking. They aren't like in PvP, you can consider them as a solid pick as A, because again, you have artilleries, bombers and stuff running around and it just clears out the back line. But overall in PvP and in PvE, monks can really, really shine, especially as captain units. They're just overall amazing units. Next up in broken, I would probably go ahead, and this is going to be a surprise to a lot of people, especially if you watch my last video. We're going to be putting the Paladin in the broken tier. So Paladins, I think, now are the absolute best tanks. And the reason why is because a lot of the game is based off of melee units. If you notice, a bunch of melee units in the game, even armored units, we're talking, like there's an armored unit that has a flamethrower that does AoE damage, it has tons of health, and it just one-shots your melee. It doesn't even make any sense, right? But Paladins actually have really, really good defense, especially if you make them heavy Paladins. They're really good in PvP, they're really good in PvE, they're really good in dungeons. Overall, they become one of the strongest units in the game, especially when coupled with something that is also broken, and that is a Centurion. Centurions, in my opinion, by themselves, if you just put them down, they're a solid pick. They're not anything crazy when you put them by themselves. But when you couple it with another Centurion and then put a Paladin with it and get yourself some healers, you have one of the most broken comps in the entire game of Stream Raiders. If it were me, say I was just now starting out in Stream Raiders, and I got a Centurion, I place the Centurion down, I place my Paladin down, and I put a Monk, you could have a really strong team with just these three right here. Obviously, you might need a little bit more range, so a Bomber or an Archer would really, really help. But these three units alone are absolutely busted, in my opinion. They're the strongest unit in the game. When Centurions get a fix where the double Centurion buff doesn't happen, they're probably going to be moved to a solid pick. But for right now, as it stands, coupling them with the other armored units like that makes them busted. So for my solid picks, because I don't think anything else is inherently busted or super broken or whatever, we're probably going to talk about the artillery, and that's something that a lot of people think are really, really strong. I personally don't think they're absolutely fundamentally broken or anything like that. They have a 4-hour cooldown. They're legendaries. That's the thing that kills them. Now, if, like, again, and I used this example earlier, if you're hooks and you have a lot of units, like say, like especially if you're a bigger captain, if you're just like, hey, I'm in PvP, I need this many artilleries, obviously you'll always have artilleries because you have a bunch of people who can place it. But if you're a medium-sized captain or a smaller-sized captain, artilleries will make or break which team wins. But I mean, if you can't place it but once every 4 hours, it doesn't really do you any good. So I'm going to say that it's a solid pick, especially in dungeons, with the way dungeons have been running so far, and the fact that you can put artilleries down and get them refreshed at boss battles are really, really vital during boss battles. They do shoot rather slow. Their attack speed is rather slow, but with a good spell or a good boon here and there, they become really, really solid. Just amazing picks overall. Outside of that, and this dates back to my video on which units I think are OP, are really, really good. Bombers are absolutely solid picks. If you have a bomber to place and you can place a bomber, bombers are absolutely monstrous. The bombers, because they're uncommon, you can place them often. It's a whole lot easier to get them to get your dupes going and everything. So once you hit level 30, you can unlock a dupe, and that's what I'm referring to if you don't know about that. And having 2 level 30 bombers, both the longer range spec, you just shit on everybody, just to be completely honest with you. Bombers are actually insane with the amount of damage that they get to do, especially when they're epic. And pretty much any dungeon, any battle, if you epic these guys, you're going to be putting in some work. Especially with a lot of them being melee, a lot of the enemies being melee, you just cleave through them. I mean, I think an epic bomber can do upwards 40, 50, 60 damage if you got flag bearers, musketeers all around it. It's just very, very, very difficult to deal with a bomber, and a bunch of epic bombers at that. Next up, we're going to do a Barbarian. Barbarians are super solid picks, in my opinion. I absolutely love Barbarians. They do have the problem, just like every other melee, where if they get too close, that could be it. If a tank doesn't tank the shots from, say, a ranged unit, or maybe they have a lot of artillery on the team, Barbarians just get wiped out. But we're looking at an overall view of how the unit itself performs, and a lot of times Barbarians can wreak havoc. They are pseudo busters. Just being able to walk up and hit one person, even if you put them on the line, they can literally cleave through so many different things when they become wild at level 20. Now obviously we might have some specs being changed when they do the switch and the rework, but for right now, again, this is going to be based off of what we see in the game. I really think Barbarians, it's getting to a point with artillery is being strong in PvP and everything else, in the way they do cleave in the game, that Barbarians and all melees can fall off. But for right now, I think even there's a lot of maps that these Barbarians really shine through on. So another solid pick would be a Musketeer. This is actually very surprising because Musketeers got a buff in PvP a long time ago, and they got a buff to make it where they could target, they prioritized ranged units first, and this really, really helped out to pick off like bombers or whatever in the front line that was taking out balloon busters and stuff. Not only that, they have a faster projectile rate, so when they shoot, the projectile goes faster than that of an archer. They buff those around them, which is an amazing, amazing thing. So you couple it with like a bomber or say a mage or even an artillery, they become amazing. You need a musketeer in every group, so they are almost always solid picks. They are rare, so they have a much longer cooldown than the rest of them, but they're really, really good picks overall. For our last solid unit, I would definitely go with a tank. I don't think the rest of these kind of fit into a super solid pick. Tanks are just monstrous in PvP. They're really, really good in PvE. They definitely got nerfed, and being able to be cut down by melee makes it where it's very difficult to have your tank survive. But because Paladin's got such a buff and being able to take those melee hits, tanks are still good because you have to have some kind of front line, but they're not super OP like they used to be. With a stronghold buff, especially in PvP, they can do well. If you put them in PvE, everywhere you go, you have to have a tank, no matter what you do. Again, coupling it with a Centurion, it becomes a really, really solid pick overall, and it can tear the battlefield up. So, completely solid pick in my opinion. I mean, if you create your own little group with a tank, it's totally worth it. So moving to situational, pretty much every assassin unit gets to be put in here, starting with a balloon buster. Balloon busters they fit a purpose, right? They are literally made to take out bosses. They're made to take out captain units, but you have to set up so much to do that, right? Because a lot of times your balloon buster will just sail in, you'll have really high hopes, and then it'll just get shot down. We've all seen the hit clips of Hooks' boss, like the very, very big super boss battles that he does, where Hooks has 700 balloon busters and he just sends them all in and kills them, right? It works. That's how it works. That's just what they're made to be. But if you put them in a normal like in a normal setting somewhere, I mean, I guess it works for dungeons because the cooldown resets every boss. But outside of that, they just, well, I mean, they're balloon busters. So if they die, they die. They're gone in dungeons. So they lose so much value. And with a 4-hour cooldown in PvE, it's just, they're situational. They're good for what the purpose that they serve, but they're not OP. You have to set up so much for PvE or PvP. If you're playing PvP, you have to have haste. You have to do all these different things. You have to make sure there's no flying rogues, no archers, no bombers, no mages. If it's real close and tight in the battle and the way the maps are lined up, you can get a balloon buster in there to do a lot of damage, but I don't think they're OP like they used to be. I don't think they're massively game changing. Also, it depends on what size of captain you are. So smaller captains, if you get hit by one balloon buster, it's probably the end of the world for you because they wreak havoc. That's what they're meant to do. But with a 4-hour cooldown, it's not necessarily that big of a deal. We're going to put the Buster in here. Busters, again, they wreak havoc on all maps, PvE, PvP, everything. Dungeons, they're really good with a specific boon that makes them revive if they at least get an assist. Outside of that, they're very situational, right? You can use them on almost every single map that you do. You can place them anywhere and you might get a couple of kills or whatever, but that's it. They're done with, right? Especially in dungeons that you have to revive them if you don't have that boon. But again, these clear up a lot of different things, especially if you make a formation and you shove a bunch of busters in the middle and let them walk out. Like, they'll path a little bit left and right. They'll do a ton of work in PvP, PvE, certain maps. I mean, you got to have these guys almost all the time just to clear things out. At level 20, they become volatile and it increases the range at which they hit. And I'm sure everybody's seen some compilations of some very nasty PvP battles with busters killing everything. So really, they're situational in overall. It just depends on the map. It depends on what you're doing, but they're definitely solid picks on a lot of different maps. So again, we're going back to that assassin. We're looking at flying rogues. There was a flying rogue meta in PvP for a good little while, I believe, where basically what ended up happening was whoever had the most flying rogues would eventually be able to take out the tanks at the end. So flying rogues are assassins. Tanks can't mitigate any of the damage that they take from flying rogues. So flying rogues will eventually end up doing full damage if there is no priority for them to attack. So if there's no other flying rogues for them to kill, no support units, and they attack whatever's nearby, it's going to do some damage to a lot of these tanks. So in PvE, you see a lot of this. You see a lot of spawners and things in the game, and it's very, very important that you have a flying rogue down for this. They do fly over and prioritize things and just get killed off on their own. So dungeons, it kind of makes them iffy. But for the most part, flying rogues are really, really good for treasure troves, taking out spawners. There's just a lot of good things that they're good at. I personally think that puts them in situational. I wouldn't put them as a solid pick. They're something that you hold on reserve, especially if you already have it max level, and just use it for specific maps, and they can do a lot of good work. So we're going to finish off the assassins with the rogue. Again, rogues are super powerful depending on the map. It really just depends on what's going on. I know people have seen it in PvP where everything dies and rogues come in and just kill the backline and take over things. We've had the chess maps where the enemy rogues are knights or whatever they were that didn't look like rogues at all. But they ran in and killed your backline and then just pretty much wipe up everything. Rogues are very, very strong in general. They're something that you absolutely have to have in your roster. One of the units that I would prioritize on leveling. Any kind of treasure chest on a map, rogues will automatically be the ones that will get to them first. They kind of did away with the old treasure chest map, so it wasn't one of those things where you had a bunch of loot goblins coming in and stealing all your treasure chest. You still see it, like occasionally it happens or whatever, but for right now, it's mostly rogues. They're so situational because they'll run into the middle of the pack just eyeballing that chest or eyeballing that ranged unit, and they'll just get killed along the way. All it takes is 1 or 2 melee units, and then bam, they're dead. But a well-placed rogue and well-placed rogues, depending on the map, will do really, really well overall. So that's why I'm putting them in situational. It all just depends on what's going on. They are solid picks on a lot of maps overall, but they can also be really, really bad and just die. this is going to be a surprise to a lot of people. I think warriors are situational. I think they really fall under the problem of melees getting taken out. They have some of the highest health pools as melee units. They have a decently high health rate. But outside of that, most people use them as busters if you make them go vengeful. They're not bad to put in as vengeful. That makes them really, really strong, especially a couple with a flag bearer. You throw them in the front line or whatever, and they'll go in and die whenever basically an artillery kills them or a bomber kills them, and they can explode and do some decent damage. But outside of that, their overall usefulness is just pretty much, I don't have a tank up, I want to just cut down a one tank unit and die. They can be good, and there are multiple ways for them to, you know, do really well on a map. But for the most part, I'm going to keep them in situational. They can really just run in and die and do nothing, or they could just not die at all and never hit anything because your bombers clear everything up, and then they're just wasting vengeful. Or I personally prefer to go rally just because you do have something. You stick them in the back with all the range units. They give a buff and with rally, and then now your range units are doing some work, and the melees will be there to cleave any kind of assassins that come in, say rogues coming in. But overall, I believe that they're situational. You can use them. They're not awful, but they're not the best in the world either. There are a couple things that make a couple of the units really, really good, and a lot of people will say a mage is like a solid pick overall. Basically, mages are very situational. Again, you get hit with the 4-hour cooldown, so it just becomes really, really rough. It's not something that I see a lot of people talk about because the 4-hour cooldown just is completely negated in, say, dungeons or if you're a bigger captain. But mages, they're pretty good when you're trying to bust down tanks. Their fire's really good to tick away, so it depends on the map and what you need them for. They're really, really good in PvP, but outside of that, bombers will probably always be better than mages just because of how often you can place them and how strong they are in general with that AoE splash. There's a couple of boons that you can get in dungeons that make them really strong, but because they're legendary, it doesn't even really matter. You can't level them without playing the battle pass or getting scrolls through quests. So it's not something that you can hyper focus on leveling. But overall, I think it's a decent unit. I think it's definitely situational. Sometimes they can just not do anything, but for the most part, their flame is pretty good. Again, this is going to be the same problem with the War Beast. The War Beast, I think, overall is a good unit. I think it's, especially if you couple it with a threatening flag bearer and you put it in the front line and let it go, War Beasts can do a lot of work, but they suffer the same problem as every other melee. They suffer the same problem of just getting taken out by ranged, and because they're on a full 4-hour cooldown, they can just get killed. So again, this is going to be highly controversial, but I think flag bearers are either B or A, honestly. Everybody always talks about how bad flag bearers are, right? Because if you have more than one of them in the same spot, they're all useless except for the highest level one. Which I'll agree, it does make them useless unless they're threatening. Threatening changes everything. When they hit level 20, they can be threatening, and threatening reduces the attack power of nearby enemies wherever it shoots its little particle. And it's like well, I guess it's an aura around it, but I think the aura is like 7 or something like that. I don't know. Basically, it reduces the attack power just like the War Beast does, but it's super small. It's like 10%. But it's not useless. I mean, it'll still do something compared to all the other flag bearers that just buff in a range, and if they all cuddle up together, nothing really matters unless they're threatening. So I think, especially if you couple these two together, they're really, really solid picks overall. But outside of that, you always have to have a flag bearer. People underestimate the fact that flag bearers double your damage when they're higher level. I mean, there's not another unit in the game that will literally stand in the back and double people's damage without just running in and dying. Like, obviously, yeah, they're not going to do anything until everything else is dead. But for the fact is that they're a common unit you can just toss out, and then bam, they buff people around you. Getting assists is really nice, especially if you want potions. They're not bad units overall. They're also really good at sacrificing. If you're using them to say somebody puts a buster in PvP, throw a flag bearer down. Congratulations, that buster is going to kill the flag bearer. They have a lot of uses, and I feel like people really don't like flag bearers overall because at the very end of the battle, they see how many people placed a flag bearer and how bad it is. It's all about how you use your flag bearer and not the flag bearer itself. Especially in smaller captain battles, you have to have flags. You have to have them in each group. It is super vital, is super important, and make sure to go threatening. So this is where it gets a little weird. Healers are very situational, and let me tell you why. I can't tell you how many times I have screamed at the top of my lungs because my healers all clump up and follow one dude and just heal that one guy. As soon as they fix pathing, these guys will be solid picks. Almost OP if you ask me. But for right now, with the way the current pathing works, they are super. I'm talking about super situational in the sense that sometimes they will excel and do super well, and sometimes they will follow that one guy off to the edge of the map and nothing will happen with them and everybody else dies and then they get cleaved down. So I feel like until then, you still have to have them in every group, just like a flag bearer. You still have to need them, like everybody needs a healer. So if you want to put them in a solid pick, that would also work for me. But as long as pathing is kind of messed up on healers, they're going to stay in situational. They are a good unit to level. If you want to level these guys, just make sure you don't level them back to back. Don't, like, say a level 3 healer is not going to do anything different than a level 4 healer. You've got to level them by milestones. And if you haven't seen that video, it's also another one of my videos that I do to kind of get you to straight on how leveling units work and how to efficiently do it. All right, moving forward. So we're going to go to C, which is good if others are on cooldown, and this is where we automatically put archers. Now, if you're a bigger captain, archers are amazing because scaling just screws you no matter what you do, right? If you have an armored unit that has 1,000 health and 1,000 damage that you've got to kill, right? That armored unit is going to kill every melee that it ever touches, right? But if you have 1,000 archers and all of them shoot and do 1 damage, well, you kill them, so it doesn't really matter. That's why archers will always be C and sometimes even B depending on the map. Sometimes you need them to snipe things, and a lot of people use them in PvP to snipe busters or whatever. So they're still decent. They're still really good overall. They're good if everything else is on cooldown. Like I always say this during my streams and battles, if you don't have a mage, if you don't have a bomber, if you don't have a musketeer, if all 3 of those are on cooldown, throw an archer out there, right? I mean, obviously they're the last range left, but the point for that is that archers are good when you have a bunch of them. Individually, they usually target tanks and do 1 damage and don't do anything. But it all just depends on what fight. It all depends on what map, what battle you're playing. If you're doing dungeons, especially dungeons, a lot of them are a lot of dungeons, the boons are like specifically made for archers and just buff them to hell and back. This is going to be a really weird one. Orc Slayers, I think, are pretty decent if others are on cooldown. I feel like with the way Dungeons has done and the way we see a lot more orcs on the battlefield, Orc Slayers are really not that awful. If you're in PvP, don't place an Orc Slayer. But if you're in PvE, you basically can get away with playing Orc Slayers everywhere, depending on the map, because Orc Slayers will be really tanky, will be really buff. You couple them with a Centurion, they actually have a buff or a boon in dungeons that make them do a lot more damage. So they're pretty solid, to be honest with you. And that makes them almost situational. But outside of that, if we take into account how PvP is with them, they're just not that great. They have one of the best epic scalings in the game. Like if you take a level 1 Orc Slayer, I think they go from 100 health to 500 when you epic them at level 1. It's crazy. It's actually insane. Outside of that, they're just beefy boys. They're they're good if you have nothing else left. So this is where it kind of gets situational, and I think it's really up to everybody's preference at this point because we really only have 3 to talk about. I'm going to start out with a vampire. I think I've seen it. I'm not entirely convinced, really, that vampires are the absolute, like, I'm not convinced about vampires. I'm going to be honest with you, and it might be my bias because most games just inherently hate melee. but you have another problem here with a melee unit. This is basically an armored unit that gets targeted by archers that takes full damage or almost full damage or a lot of damage from archers. You get that problem where if there's a bunch of ranged on the enemy team and you put a vampire out, they're just going to get killed. They're not going to be able to do anything. That's just how they work. They're good if you make them epic and make them a bloodlust vampire, but outside of that, I think they really need to rework. They need some kind of defense. They need some kind of something. They don't receive healing, so the only healing that they get is from when they attack enemies. And that just makes it situational. I mean, healers really didn't heal too much to begin with. I mean, they heal a little, but like, see them run off and heal other things is just completely different. But vampires, again, I think they need to rework them. They do a lot of damage. They are really, really heavy on damage, and they're really good at cutting things down, but they have to be grouped together. There's so many things that they have to do to make them decent, right? Like, why would you put a vampire down when you can put a bomber, or when you can put a tank, or when you can put a paladin? Like, what's the point of putting a vampire other than the fact that everybody loves Ovi, and Ovi's pretty cool. Moving forward, we have the same thing with Templars. Templars are exactly the same thing. They're really, really strong when buffing others. I think the problem is that they're basically a glorified flag bearer that's on a 4-hour cooldown. They can do decent damage, but they're just not beefy enough to withstand a bomber blast or any kind of range units hitting them. They just get cut down too quickly. They fall in the same category where melee just gets shit on. That's just how it works. Outside of that, if you put them really far back in the middle of your like musketeers, bombers, mages and stuff, artillery, they're not terrible. You can buff people up, but again, it needs to be reworked with all of these melee killing classes. They just get killed. So this is also the same problem we have with Berserkers. Berserkers can be really good. If you place them in a really good group, say you place them in a group of vengeful warriors, you place them in a group of barbarians, buff them up, and send them in. They have a lot of health. They have a lot of just pure damage. But if you don't have that, if you're not set up for that, they're almost worthless because they just get killed way too easily. You send them out, they just die. It's just a problem with melee. They can buff really well. They can do a lot of work. They can do a lot of damage, but there's just too much that has to happen for them to really work out. If you want some potions and some assist in PvE, they'll be C. You throw them in the middle of some melee units, they'll be really strong. Outside of that, they're just not that great. I think they need to be reworked. Vampires were actually going to have Unsure has potential because I've seen some vampires do really, really well. But when you couple it with everything that's been going on where you have to put vampires together, you have to have centurions near them, champion paladins, they have to be bloodlust, they have to be epic. They can be strong, but because of all of that against them, it really just makes it tough for them. All right, y'all, that is my opinion on all of the Stream Raiders units and how I feel about them currently. Again, this could change. They could have a patch next week. They could have a patch in the next couple of days. It all depends on what's going on. So if you're watching this video 6 months to a year from now and you're like, oh man, I really want to know what's really good for Stream Raiders, take this with a grain of salt, figure it out, play the game a little bit more. But this is an overall guideline to help everybody kind of understand how the units are working right now and how well they perform depending on the battles, depending on dungeons and stuff like that. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you like this and you want to see more kind of tier lists or anything like that, or just in general, Stream Raiders guides, make sure to come over to my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/AlfredGG. We do a lot of exciting things for Stream Raiders. We have Skin of the Week on Tuesdays where we look at all the skins that came out the previous week, and we also do some podcasts where we talk about everything that's going on in Stream Raiders on Thursdays. So if those are things that you are interested in, make sure to come check me out. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe for future videos about Stream Raiders and just overall general advice.